I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker. Professor Jacob Sherkow is currently a professor of law at New York Law School and the Edmund J. Safra and Petrie Flom Center's Joint Fellow in Residence at Harvard University. But in a few weeks, he'll be joining the University of Illinois as a professor of law. His research focuses on the relationship between scientific development, especially in biotechnology and the pharmaceutical industry, and patent law, regulation, and bioethics. He's the author of over 40 articles in both scientific journals and traditional law reviews, including Science, Nature, the Yale Law Journal, and the Stanford Law Review. He's also been appointed to the National Academy of Medicine as an emerging leader in health and medicine, serves on the editorial board of the peer-reviewed CRISPR Journal, and is a frequent commentator on media outlets. And so with that, it's my absolute pleasure to turn it over to him.
Jason, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to try to use the share screen feature to put up some slides here. Let's see if this works. Jason, are you able to see slides?
I can see slides. They all look good.
All right, wonderful. So I know our time is short today, so I'm going to talk for between 15 or 20 minutes, and then I'm more than happy to spend the rest of the time during questions. I think many people have fatigue from Zoom, and so I think the Q&A is probably better than me lecturing for a longer period of time. I'm going to be speaking about drug shortages, or more specifically about COVID-19 drug shortages and what this means for innovation policy. My presentation stems from a series of blog posts that I have been writing with Lisa Willett on her blog Written Description, and my co-authors Rachel Sachs and Nicholson Price, who are also going to be presenting at this series here. So much of the work of what I'm presenting is actually a joint effort between me, Lisa, Rachel, and Nicholson. Okay, so let's talk about kind of drug shortages generally. Drug shortages are exactly what they sound like, right? There is not enough drug to go around to meet supply in certain instances. In some cases, this is because there is literally no company authorized in the United States to manufacture that drug, and stockpiles are essentially zero. Or in other instances, while there is some drug otherwise remaining, it cannot, for a number of reasons, meet the demand that is otherwise needed to treat all patients out there. And in some particularly egregious cases, patients need to ration that particular drug, in some cases not actually getting the full dose of the treatment that they need. This is a persistent issue, and I think it's somewhat of a paradox, right? We think of drugs as being expensive. In the drug industry, I think many people rightly know, is one of the most profitable industries in the United States. And so that would tend to suggest that we may have many problems with pharmaceutical policy, but shortages aren't necessarily going to be one of them. Nonetheless, shortages happen, and they happen with some frequency. And so in 2019, FDA completed a report that tried to assess exactly what the causes of drug shortages were and what potential solutions there were, if any. I think one of the more interesting aspects of the report was some of the empirical data behind it to figure out exactly how often and how persistent drug shortages were. The FDA report from 2019 looked at rolling 5-year averages and found that during the course of some of the rolling 5-year averages that the report looked at, there were an average of 163 drugs in shortage. And some of these drugs, manufacturing was literally zero. That is, the drug was not available to be distributed in the United States. And in other instances, it just simply did not meet supply in any meaningful way. This is not because of the particular type of drug that happens to be in shortage. In fact, the drugs that do go into shortage, as noted in this 2019 FDA report, come from really diverse classes of pharmaceuticals, right? We have anesthetics, we have antibiotics, we have cardiac medications out there. Perhaps most, I won't say perniciously, but most concerning are cases in which there are oncological drugs that patients would otherwise need to either treat their cancer or extend lifespan that otherwise are in shortage, and there's likely to be an accompanying mortality associated with that. This is a persistent problem that FDA is otherwise aware of, and they're looking into exactly what some of the causes were and which drugs are in shortage. There's actually a website you can go to, FDA puts up, to look at a list of exactly which approved drugs happen to be in shortage at any given moment. I think one of the most notable things about the report is this conclusion, that essentially the marketplace often fails to respond to drug shortages in a way that it self-corrects. This conclusion essentially that this is a market failure, right? You have an instance in which you have demand is high, you have supply is low, and for whatever reason, supply cannot meet demand. You know, classic example of what a market failure there is. And so I think that that's important because I think some of the policy here is not necessarily tethered to classical market economics. I'll talk about this a little bit at the end when I'm talking about some of the innovation policy levers that we could use. Some of the principal causes of drug shortages, as noted in FDA's report, are the following, and I'll just kind of briefly go through each one here, right? First, the seems like the most persistent cause of drug shortages is what the report terms price eroding generic competition. That is, that there are so many generic manufacturers on the market that price goes down to often something that approximates marginal cost. At that point, it becomes just totally unprofitable to manufacture any more of the drug. It also becomes unprofitable for any additional generic manufacturers to enter the market because, as is true in generic drugs generally, the only way to position oneself in the market is through price. And if price is already at marginal cost, or in some cases even lower than marginal cost, it's just not a profitable business to be in. In addition, once the public gets used to paying a certain price for a particular generic drug, even attempts to raise that price as a shortage happen may otherwise be resistant because the mindset is that the drug is only worth a certain value, right? It's only, should only cost so much, and that even if there's a shortage going around, attempts to fix that through price controls just would not necessarily work because the price has eroded at that point. In addition, another problem with drug shortages is the batch manufacturing system that we have. So in contrast, almost every other consumer good that you purchase, be it computers or tube stocks, drugs are not manufactured on a continuous production system, which can otherwise be modulated to adjust to shortages if needed. Rather, drugs are manufactured in batches, essentially en masse. This is done for a number of reasons. So the main reason having to do with the quality control that FDA mandates. In order to make sure that drugs, especially drugs like sterile injectables, are appropriately sterile, are appropriately potent, and have been manufactured under some of the CGMP regulations that FDA has. In addition, a number of drugs that are in shortage or otherwise controlled are restricted substances. And so DEA, in some cases, has put out some quotas as to how much drug could be manufactured at any given time. This is certainly true when it comes to painkillers and opioids, more of which I'll talk about in just a moment. But this also means that if we're dealing with the batch manufacturing system, we've essentially put an artificial ceiling on how much drug can be made, such that it is more likely that a shortage is going to happen in the future if we have a spike in demand. In addition, simply there's just this kind of supply and demand lag, right? Drugs can only be manufactured at authorized facilities. They can't necessarily be manufactured overnight. There needs to be some testing that goes into before they're released into the market. And so even if we have demand, a spike in demand on, say, a Monday, this doesn't mean that we can ramp up the facility on a Wednesday and have more drug on a Friday. What this means essentially is that there's always going to be a lag between when, if we have a drug shortage, patients actually need the drug and when it can actually come off the conveyor belt and get delivered into patients' veins. I can't help but note this line from FDA's report, and that is that the agency has hypothesized that one of the best reasons to solve the drug shortage problem is because it may become a bigger problem in the case that we have a pandemic, right? The strength of our nation's public health mandates that the agency or Congress figure out how to solve drug shortages so we can, quote, quickly mobilize a coordinated national response to pandemics. And to be clear, this is not December of 2019. This is in the spring of 2019. This is yet another piece of evidence on top of the pile that we could have had a number of pieces in place to combat the pandemic if only we actually use them, right? All right, so those are drug shortages generally. Let's briefly talk about drug shortages for coronavirus specifically. So there's a number of exacerbating causes in the COVID-19 case that makes drug shortages even worse. first is that the types of drugs that tend to be needed are older, sterile injectables. And this is certainly true for the drugs that are needed to ventilate or intubate people. Older sterile injectables are much more difficult to manufacture. They need to go through more rigorous quality control systems, and they're also costly to make, and they're done at, generally speaking, kind of older and aging facilities that don't necessarily have the capacity to rapidly ramp up production as is otherwise needed. In addition, it seems to be somewhat self-evident, right? But the spike in demand for drugs that are used to treat coronavirus has been extreme. Number of case counts have gone up. We have all read stories about hospitals being overwhelmed with patients, about them needing to clear out PICUs just to put COVID patients there. And this extreme spike in demand has otherwise been sudden, and therefore that has created a shortage that otherwise has been difficult to ameliorate. In addition, many of these drugs are not manufactured only in the United States, but they're manufactured elsewhere in the world. And there's been a major supply chain disruption around the world lately. And this is true for a number of reasons, right? Facilities have been shuttered that manufacture drugs have been shuttered for public health reasons. People who work at the facilities have otherwise been banned from going to them. People who work at the facilities are otherwise suffering from the coronavirus itself or some other ailment and are unable to work. All of the lines down, right, in terms of physically manufacturing the drug, getting it ready for export, testing it, getting it out of the country, right? This has all been somewhat hamstrung by the way that countries have both responded internally to domestic public health priorities and in terms of travel. And so by kind of putting up barriers to the global supply chain, this makes drug shortages worse in the coronavirus context. In addition, some countries, at least as of a couple of weeks ago, had some export bans on particular drugs. The drugs were so valuable within their particular country that they decided they were going to ban the export of it. This was true for India, for HCQ, at least as of then. We'll talk, just briefly mention this in a moment. It's probably no longer concerning, but to the extent that we do find sometime in the future some, maybe not a miracle cure, but some really otherwise wonderful drug to treat coronavirus in whatever form that it happens to take, if that's manufactured in a country outside the United States, and if there's a shortage for that particular drug, one of the things we should be worried about is whether or not that is going to be allowed for export here into the export from that country for import here into the United States. Just a couple of examples of the types of drugs used to treat coronavirus for which there's a shortage, right? You have propofol and fentanyl. These are both sedatives that are used to treat patients who need to be ventilated or intubated, who are having breathing difficulties that are associated with COVID. In addition, azithromycin is a particularly important antibiotic to combat some of the secondary infections that arise in some cases with coronavirus and some pneumonia that's associated with having a COVID infection. In addition, at least until recently, right, we had a shortage for hydroxychloroquine. That now seems to be much less concerning now that we know that the risks seem to strongly outweigh the benefits of the drug, whatever those may actually be. But for a while it seemed like HCQ was going to be a treatment for coronavirus, FDA noted that it too was in shortage. Just want to briefly mention this report, this fascinating report that came out only 2 weeks ago from Lisa Girion, Dan Levine, and Robin Rispo. Essentially, one of the more pernicious problems has to deal with some of the sterile injectable sedatives that are needed to intubate and ventilate COVID-19 patients. One of the more problematic aspects of this is that it seems like there has been a long history of innovation policy that has disfavored the sterile and injectable forms of opioids that are otherwise needed in the hospital setting for outpatient opioids, the sort that we associate with the opioid crisis, or for other conditions there. Again, manufacturing these sterile injectables, that is opioids that essentially get shot into a sterile saline bag, tend to be extremely cheap. They tend to be purchased by hospitals who are otherwise cost conscious. And this report found out that hospitals pay somewhat on average about $76.99, right? That 99 cents always gets you to get a drip bag of fentanyl, for example, that is used to ventilate patients who are suffering from COVID. But if you're in the oncology ward, right, the same active pharmaceutical ingredient formulated for a nasal spray is $985. And it's a tenfold difference in price that has essentially encouraged all of the opioid manufacturers to move to more of the outpatient, non-ventilated, non-COVID, non-sterile injectable setting into these high dollar figure opioid formulations. I think in the coronavirus instance, this is going to be particularly problematic in states, or at least in regions in which we have an older population that's more likely to be ventilated, right? We're going to have this kind of massive shortage as cases spike in order to ventilate patients, right? It's going to need these sedatives to intubate patients who are suffering from COVID. I think Florida perhaps is a classic example, right? So just yesterday, right, Florida's 2-week rolling average for coronavirus cases was 182.6%. And so if we're going to assume that a large portion of those people are older and that they are, as a result, more likely to be ventilated, right, 2 weeks from now, I would imagine that we would have a massive sterile injectable opioid shortage in Florida, something to pay attention to, I guess. So let me kind of wrap up with kind of some of the innovation policy levers that may or may not be useful for treating this drug shortage problem we have for coronavirus these days. Let me start off by noting what the problem is not, right? The problem is decidedly not patents, right? And I think this is somewhat counterintuitive. We tend to think of patents as giving the patent owner the right to restrict supply, right? If you have a particular drug, right, you have a patent that's covering a particular drug, you get to set the price, you get to determine how much is manufactured, and to the extent that we have a shortage, right, well, it seems like, okay, well, someone's restricting manufacturing, right? No, there's the opposite of, in fact, what is happening. As I noted before, the problem that we have had for many of these drug shortages is so much generic competition that has essentially eaten the market. This is because likely there are not any patents that happen to be protecting these particular drugs, and so patents don't seem to be causing some of the major shortages problems that we have, both for drugs generally, but also in the coronavirus case specifically. Let me just note, just because I'm saying that patents are not the problem does not mean that I'm saying patents are the solution. I'm just simply noting that it does not seem to be that IP-related restrictions are the things that are causing shortages here. One of the things that FDA's 2019 report does know is that one of the best ways to combat drug shortage problems is through better reporting. And so to that end, the CARES Act, which was passed in response to the coronavirus pandemic, does have a beefed up reporting system, but it places almost the entire onus in that reporting on FDA as opposed to manufacturers of those drugs, where it does impose requirements on manufacturers. The requirements are somewhat toothless. In addition, for reasons that I fail to understand, and maybe one of the participants knows, this specific aspect of the CARES Act has been delayed. That is, it does not become effective until September of 2020. I think it's September 23rd, 2020. That is, at least in coronavirus time, right? That is a long time from now. And it is unclear whether or not drug shortages are going to be a specific problem that we're going to be dealing with in September of this year. One innovation policy lever is to just simply compel manufacturing facilities that are authorized to make drugs that are needed to treat coronavirus just to ramp up production, right? And one of the ways to do that was to use the Defense Production Act to get manufacturing facilities that were authorized by FDA to just make more of the drugs that they were making. For a number of reasons, this just has not been used, or at least has not been used specifically to combat drug shortages. And so while this seems to be an innovation policy lever that we could use, we have not used it so far, right? You can also license new manufacturing facilities, right? But at the same time, manufacturing, and again, manufacturing, especially drugs or sterile injectables, do come with them some significant risks. And so certifying some of these facilities and making sure that they are actually doing the job safely is going to take time. And so if we do have a shortage on the books, again, on say a Monday, this does not mean we're going to have the capacity to license a new manufacturing facility on a Tuesday, or for that matter, on a Friday or 2 weeks from now, right? There's a reason, good reasons, why FDA has been stringent about licensing new facilities to make this the story about the New England Compounding Center, although was not otherwise under FDA purview, at least as of that time, right? I think is a particularly instructive case about how manufacturing, especially for products that are otherwise meant to be sterile, how that can go wrong, right? Another possibility is to otherwise encourage continuous manufacturing, and there are some instances in which FDA does have some policies to encourage continuous rather than batch manufacturing here. But the reality is this just takes a major investment in some of the manufacturing facilities that we have. And as a lot of Nicholson Price's scholarship has noted, the incentives to improve manufacturing just really aren't as strong as the incentives to make the end products themselves. And so while we can try to encourage continuous manufacturing for coronavirus drug shortages that we have now, it's gonna take time, and it's gonna take a major investment. Let me just finish. Did you have just a couple of conclusions to wrap this up before we take some questions, right? If you want to take away 3 things from this, I think they are these, right? The first is that drug shortages are common even in normal circumstances, and this is one of the more stunning findings of the 2019 FDA report. COVID-19, it's put a strain on many facets of the functioning drug market, from incentives of which types of drugs are needed to actually manufacture, which types of manufacturing are otherwise encouraged, the way the supply chain works. COVID-19 has really frayed this rope in many different ways. Lastly, the reality is that innovation policy we currently have in the books is just not geared towards manufacturing. And as a result, there just aren't really any kind of easy, quick fixes. There was this great quote, I think it's the kicker in that Lisa Jurian article that I put up earlier. And I think the kicker was, if there was an easy button to push, that would have been pushed a long time ago. This is certainly true in the manufacturing context, and it's going to be true as we continue to combat the coronavirus pandemic here. Thanks for your time. I'm going to switch screens and take a look to see whether we have some questions here. So I've got 3. Yeah, so I've got 3. So let me go through a couple of these, right? I mean, I think this is Jason. This is the best way to do this, to go through the questions we have on the
Sure, if you want to go right through that,
Q&A
and if others want to add in additional questions, that is a great way to do it, right through the questions tool.
Sure, no problem. And I think I've lost.
And if you want me to unmute anyone to explain, I'm happy to
Sure.
do that.
No. It sounds fine. So I am going to. I don't know. Jason, can everyone see the Q&As? I just don't know whether I should list the names of people who are asking these questions.
I do not think so, but I don't know.
All right. Well, how about this? So one of the questions that we have coming in is that it's been floated that the FDA's drug shortage list should be like a trigger for Bayh-Dole Marchand rights or Section 1498 authority. And I think like one of the questions is like whether the FDA's process could withstand that kind of pressure or not, right? So again, right, it seems like the problem when it comes to at least the vast majority of drug shortages that we have is not that we have one company with patents that otherwise is preventing a number of manufacturers that are out there from getting on the market who otherwise would. It's that we have so many manufacturers in one place at one time that the price of the particular drug has been eroded to essentially marginal cost, and nobody wants to make it anymore. It's like somewhat of the Yogi Berra innovation policy problem, right? You know, the Yogi Berra saw it so crowded, nobody goes there anymore. The drug is so cheap, no one wants to make it anymore, right? I mean, that's essentially, I think, one of the problems that we have here, right? A related question to this point is whether I knew of the percentage, or whether someone knows, of the percentage of cases of drug shortages that we have where patents have been a significant impediment. I certainly don't know off the top of my head. I would imagine that the answer is greater than 0, right? Like I would imagine that is probably true for at least some cases. I think you could probably figure that out, I'd say almost using the process of elimination from the FDA's 2019 report, right? You would essentially exclude all of these cases in which it seems like there was robust generic competition or dumping of the particular product or a hang up on the manufacturing facility end. And it could actually figure out cases in which there really just has been a problem of manufacturing or for whatever reason, an artificial restriction of supply for drugs that were on patent. Again, as noted in the FDA's report, whatever number that is going to be less than the majority. It's going to be a small minority of the drugs that are in shortage, but I've got a feeling the number is greater than zero. It would be worth investigating, right? Okay. I realize I'm going through these questions relatively quickly, but I want to make sure that we stay somewhat on time. So another question that we've had come in, right? Says that patents are part of the belt which enables the restrictions against the intervention of the government manufacturing these particular drugs, right? So I think that is generally true for drugs that happen to be, quote, on patent, but not so much so that FDA notes that those drugs have been in shortage, right? So we're really only talking about situations in which there's literally not enough supply of the drug to get to every patient who could otherwise pay for it to have it. Now, I recognize that that's not the same question as saying, like, do we have enough drug for everybody that needs it, right? Insulin, I think, perhaps is a really wonderful example of a drug for which I think classical economists would suggest we don't actually have a shortage. What we just have is like not enough people who could pay the full freight price, right? And we could talk about whether or not that's a sensible way to look at things. I certainly don't personally think that it's sensible. But again, the focus of my talk, the focus of FDA's report is there enough drug out there at essentially the price that anyone is willing to pay for it, not whether or not some people are excluded from the market because those specific individuals just don't have enough cash, right? All right. So another question discusses some of the proposals, right, to have multi-institution purchasing for hospitals, right? We're just going to kind of like aggregate purchasing in a number of hospitals out there, and maybe using that, right, we can kind of coordinate some of the friction in the market, right, where essentially some hospital doesn't necessarily have a drug that happens to be in shortage, another hospital does, and so these hospitals share. Not, I would assume, entirely different from what happened when it came to states sharing ventilators about a month or 2 months ago, right? The question is whether these hospitals are encountering any legal impediments to doing so. And I have to say, I don't know, right? Generally speaking, FDA's authority when it comes to drugs, there doesn't necessarily need to be a cash register event that's happening, simply whether or not the drugs are crossing state lines. So I would imagine that FDA would have to say something about a purchaser, even in good faith, shipping a quantity of drug to a third party outside of that particular state. But I just don't know whether or not that is something that has risen to the level where it is currently trying to be stopped, or whether there's a legal impediment to doing so. I think one of the things that we're seeing in the coronavirus pandemic so far is that to the extent that there are healthcare providers, for the most part, to the extent that there are healthcare providers trying to do creative things to ensure that they have enough facility to both get drugs to patients, to get devices to patients. I think the FDA has, again, for the most part, not entirely, tried to stay out of the way mostly. Some famous instances of the opposite, but so I don't think this is going to be a case in which we would see a serious hang up from FDA, but the future remains unseen these days, right? All right, so I think I've got time for about 2 more questions. Also, knowing that this ends at 3, and I know that many people want to go relatively soon. Here are the 2 more questions that I will take left. Right? Does it make sense to enact some kind of DPA? This is the Defense Production Act. Does it make sense to enact a DPA-style law by which the government creates a market for drugs that are in shortage? Right. So I think slightly better way of answering that question is like, does it make sense to have the government itself manufacture these drugs to make up for that shortage, right? Like the whole idea of a shortage is that there is a market for the drug and the market is not being met. So it doesn't make sense in that context for essentially the government to have a drug manufacturing facility to make up these cases for shortage. And whether that can be done through the Defense Production Act or another act, I think would come down to the particulars of the program that one is interested in. To a certain extent that it does. We have national stockpiles for a great many of things, from helium to cheese. And we do, to be clear, have national stockpiles for certain drugs. But the government has otherwise not necessarily been in the business of manufacturing these drugs specifically to combat shortage requirements. I've been a lot of scholars, I'm not included on this list, but there have been a lot of scholars who have written about just this. And I think, if there were any time in which a policy like that would start to begin to make sense, it would, I was going to say it probably would be now. I think that the better answer is it would have been yesterday, or it would have been in January. But it may make sense to think of one of the government's responsibilities to not only house a stockpile of drugs, but also to engage in some at least minimal manufacturing to ensure that in cases of significant public health emergency, especially when the market is otherwise crushed, that the government is going to have the capacity to step in and cure these particular problems, right? All right, last question. How much of the shortages are due to overseas production versus domestic production limitations, right? So I don't have the number from the 2019 report as to how much it is true generally. I will say that in the case of coronavirus, the vast majority of active pharmaceutical ingredients for sedatives are manufactured outside of the United States, fentanyl specifically. And so with that in mind, right, to the extent, and I think based on the Reuters report, I think China is the largest manufacturer by weight of fentanyl, right? And so based on that, the shortage that we are seeing is one of somewhat of an overseas production, I don't want to say an overseas production problem, but is a supply chain problem that couldn't otherwise be fixed. That could not otherwise be fixed with the domestic policy standing alone. We need the coordination of other countries. That's just simply the global supply chain for drugs that we have now. There are other great questions I'd love to stop and answer, but I know we're already 4 minutes over time. I'll just answer this very last question that just popped up with somewhat of a punt, but also a highlight to some future work. Here's the question. Are there policies in place for addressing disparities in access to these drugs? Disparities being socioeconomic disparities, racial disparities, regional disparities. So I'm recently, me and my co-authors at the Written Description blog in this COVID series have written at least 2 blog posts essentially based on socioeconomic and racial disparities when it comes to COVID treatment and some innovation problems there. So I strongly encourage you to go on Written Description and take a look at this blog series that we are posting now. That's it. I'm 5 minutes over. So Jason, I just wanted to thank you, and I wanted to thank my God, 29 people who came all the way across the internet to hear me talk. Thank you very much for hosting me, Jason, and thank you everyone so much for coming.
Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you, Jake, for that really terrific talk. I want to second the recommendation of checking out the Written Description blog series on this. It's really, really terrific. And I hope you all join us next week for Nicholson Price's talk. So I'll see you all then.